Hi, I'm John Elizondo, and this is Launchpad.
We found Sumatran tiger tracks in some of the areas that we were camping. You really start to think about what are these wild creatures doing out here.
That's what it's actually like on the ground, according to Dr. Kyle Shaney. He teaches wildlife ecology and conservation at UT San Antonio, and he's featured in this episode. He's here to share his experiences with animals in their natural environments and help us answer the question, do you know what to do in a wildlife encounter? If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss any new episodes. Let's get started. Mountain lions, crocodiles, and bears, oh my. While most of us would run the other way, our next guest heads straight towards the action. From the forest of New Mexico to the remote waters of Indonesia, Dr. Kyle Shaney has traveled the globe studying the world's most fascinating wildlife. We're thrilled to have him join us today to discuss his latest research and share some incredible tales from the field. Please welcome Dr. Kyle Shaney. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're excited to have you here too. You have a very interesting story. You're a first-generation college graduate, and I'm sure in your wildest dreams, you never expected to travel the world studying some fascinating animals.
Yeah, so I grew up in Reno, Nevada, and I grew up exploring the Great Basin Desert with my dad and going out fishing, hunting, camping, just loving the outdoors, enjoying the outdoors. Being a first-gen college student, I had no idea that this was a career path, no idea that any of these things existed. And it took exposure to some different things in order to see that that was possible. I'm very curious and fascinated by all the wild creatures of the world. And I also see the importance of all those things. And humans are inherently linked to all of biodiversity and nature. And what we see over and over again is when we mismanage our natural resources, it has negative consequences for human health and well-being, right? And so the importance of all this is to take care of biodiversity and manage it in a sustainable way so that we can benefit people. But also on the flip side, it also benefits these wild species and ecosystems and things that inherently, I think, have their place here as well, and things that are just beautiful. And it's an opportunity for people to appreciate what our planet has in terms of biodiversity. So I think there's benefits for everyone in some way, and also for the wild things of the world.
So let's talk a little bit about your wildlife adventures. It started volunteering, correct?
Yes.
Volunteering doing what? Because I know it takes a lot to do something for free, but being around mountain lions is probably not something that people would normally want to do willingly.
I mentioned that there was a cougar project, and this was at Utah State when I was an undergraduate student. And I went and talked to this PhD student at the time. His name is David Stoner. He's a professor there now, and asked him if I could be involved with their mountain lion project. And I had no experience at the time. And for some reason, he let me go out and volunteer some time. And that initial start was going out and investigating mountain lion kill sites. And so the way that they can track where these kill sites are is they have satellite tracking collars on their mountain lions that they're studying. And anywhere where a mountain lion kills a prey item, a deer, elk, whatever it might be, they leave GPS points in a cluster on the map. So our job was to go into the center point of those clusters, investigate the kill site. Sometimes it was pretty old and there wasn't there wouldn't be a cat around at that point in time, but collect all that data. And then over time, we could piece together whatever the dietary composition was for male mountain lions in that area or female mountain lions, whatever it may be. So I contributed to that project early on. And then after doing that for about a year, they invited me out on an actual capture. And we went out on muleback through the mountains in Utah. I went out with a couple of folks they're considered world-renowned houndsmen. And believe it or not, that is a job. And we went out and tracked a mountain lion, a male, with hound dogs. And then we treat it and we did the whole workup, put it to sleep with tranquilizers. And then I got to put a collar on my first cat while I was an undergraduate. That's how it started. I was volunteering on all that work. And slowly but surely, I was able to eventually get jobs after that.
And when you capture these mountain lions, we're not talking about catching a raccoon in your backyard or something like that. What does it take to try to capture a mountain lion in the wild?
It's pretty complicated. It's kind of, it depends on what method you use. And we can get to this later. I also have a cougar project now, and we use different methods. But one of the main methods is when you pursue them with hound dogs, the hounds track them and they smell the scent on the ground if it's a fresh enough track. Fresh snow helps if you have it, but you can do it on dry ground. And eventually those cats, they get tired when those dogs are chasing them through the forest or through the mountains and go up a tree. From there, you have to decide if it's a safe enough tree to do your workup. If you decide to proceed, you tranquilize the cat. And then typically what they'll do is as they're falling asleep, they'll lay down on the branches and start to go to sleep. And somebody has to go up the tree while that process is happening and get a rope around the mountain lion and then safely lower that mountain lion to the ground. You're trying not to hurt anyone on the team and not to hurt the animal. And then once that animal is on the ground, then you can go ahead and start to take blood samples, hair samples. You can take measurements, check the canines, see what the dentition looks like. Then you can put a tracking collar on the animal. And so that from then on, you can monitor movement patterns. It's like walking a tightrope because sometimes they go to sleep easy. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can be in a really precarious spot and it's stressful.
I would assume they get agitated easily.
Absolutely. Usually they're not happy when you show up to the tree and there's hound dogs barking and then they see a bunch of people down there circled around the tree. The thing is with these mountain lions, they actually want to just get away and they don't have a tendency to come after folks. But once you get up in the tree, if they're not asleep, you definitely have to be careful.
You mentioned that they don't want to come after people. And that's something that I did want to ask you. What are some misconceptions about mountain lions? It's probably not very common for this to happen around here in Texas, but people go out all the time. They go hiking, maybe in some remote parts of the country. They might come across these animals. What is probably the smartest thing to know about mountain lions if you ever encounter one in the wild, and things that you should be mindful of?
In general, they are a big predator, but they are not usually looking at humans as prey, and they're not attacking people very often. It's actually very rare, right? Considering how many millions of people are out recreating on wild landscapes that overlap with the geographic range of mountain lions, there are very few attacks every single year. So that's one thing that folks should take some comfort in, and they should be out there enjoying their time and not being stressed about mountain lions too much. That being said, it can happen, right? And they're a big predator. Females can be 80, 90 plus pounds, and the male mountain lions can be 130 to 140, 150 sometimes, and sometimes even bigger. And they occasionally are very interested in people. And so sometimes people will see them watching a person, or if someone thinks that a mountain lion is approaching or being aggressive, the person should then shift to being on the offensive, and they should try and make themselves look big. They should try and shout and try and scare that mountain lion away. Oftentimes that will be enough. And if it's not, if it comes down to a point where something does happen, then a person should fight. And that's a very rare occasion.
So when a mountain lion has a kill site, do they just eat and then leave? Or is it one of those things that they may come back? Did you ever have an encounter where they showed up when you're thinking, oh, they're gone, but oh, they're coming back for more?
Yeah. So a lot can happen at these kill sites. And we're actually actively studying this. So what happens after a fresh kill is made? And a lot of times these mountain lions, they will stay and feed for 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 days because they may kill an animal as big as an elk. It may be a 600 or 700 pound animal. And that's an ample food supply for a long time. So it's in their best interest, once they've gone through the stress of actually killing a prey item, it's best for them to just stay put and feed on that animal as long as they can. And typically they will, unless they are interrupted by another wild animal. And sometimes that could be another mountain lion. Mountain lions kill other mountain lions. And so if there's a smaller mountain lion there, it's in their best interest to leave at that point. Sometimes black bears will come in and kick mountain lions off of their kills. There's an ecological term for that called Kleptoparasitism. And basically they're parasitizing the kill from the mountain lion. And then that drives the mountain lion away and causes them to have to kill more often, right? So depending on how high the black bear density is, there may be a good chance that a black bear will move in and that cat will have to leave on day 2 or day 3 or whenever it may be. The dynamics that occur after that first kill of the prey item really dictate how long and how those cougars will behave at that site. And there's a lot of other interesting things that happen there. You know, we're currently putting up video and photo camera traps at fresh kill sites so that we can study all these dynamics, because there's a lot of little creatures that come into those kills as well. There's all these different kinds of birds. You have golden eagles, you have vultures, sometimes things like magpies, other scavenging birds will come in. We're also even looking at the invertebrate composition. We're starting to look at what kinds of insects are feeding on those kills. You find these interesting carrion beetles that they only feed on meat of dying animals, and they move in on these kill sites. So it's also supplying the whole ecosystem with nutrients. And there's a lot of things that happen after that initial kill.
Has there ever been anything surprising that has shown up on your videos when you go back and watch it later?
So this is a pretty new component to our work, and I don't have a ton of video data accumulated yet, but I'm collaborating with a guy named Mark Payton, and he's been doing some of that same work for quite a while over in New Mexico, and we're partnering on this project. I personally have seen a big male move in on a female's kill. 2 weeks ago, we put out cameras in New Mexico, and then I got videos sent by Mark last week, and there was a male that had moved in and was feeding alongside the female that had killed the elk. And the male looked kind of unhappy while he was watching her chew on the elk in the video, but they were tolerating one another. And to see that behavior is really interesting. There's a lot of things that are going on out there in the wild that we would just normally never be able to lay eyes on.
And for you, what do you learn from that? I can only imagine how valuable that kind of visual data is, because as you said, this isn't something you normally see, or even if you see it, maybe they scatter, maybe they just don't interact the same way. What is the value that you get out of observing these kind of interactions?
You can do a few things. So for example, you can calculate if you count the number of days that it takes for certain predators to move in, for example, the black bears, and you go from there and you can calculate how many days on average does it take for a bear to kleptoparasitize a kill. And then you can estimate how many more deer or elk or mountain lions going to have to kill on average in this area in order to fulfill their energetic requirements. And that tells you something about the impacts of predators on prey in those ecosystems. There's a whole story behind this, but we've seen much of the country and much of the whole continent where top predators were wiped out in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in some of those areas, now that role that cougars played historically is no longer there in the ecosystem, right? Cougars originally lived all the way over to the East Coast of the United States. And since the early 1900s, when they were hunted out, their range now pretty much stops in the middle of the country. And so there's a whole half of the United States that now lacks that top predator in those ecosystems. We can learn a lot about the role that they play from these kinds of studies.
I want to move on to a different predator that you also study, crocodiles. And as a former college football player, well, I have to ask, what has been more terrifying in your life? Trying to go over the middle to catch a football against a linebacker, or being face to face with a crocodile?
I would say probably the crocodile is scarier. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely some big guys on the field too. Some that you don't want to take your head off, but yeah.
Well, I know your life changed after your football career. While at UT Arlington pursuing your PhD, you applied for a grant. that kind of sparked everything that you're doing now with crocodiles. Can you tell us that story and how that came to be, where you wound up in Indonesia studying these animals?
That was a really pivotal point in my whole career. At that point, I was a PhD student working with a guy named Eric Smith at UT Arlington. And at the time, he was trying to explore Indonesia and find as many new species as possible. And I was working on that project, but I also had interest in crocodiles. And I saw potential for the crocodile work to translate to some other things I wanted to do in the future. And so I went to him and I said, hey, I really like this work you're doing with discovering new species, and I want to keep being involved with that. But would you consider letting me try and do some work on this endangered crocodile? It's called the Sunda Gharial. And it's only found basically in Malaysia and Indonesia in one small region. Very little until this day is known about this species. And he looked at me at the time and he said, I'll tell you what, if you can find funding to go out and do the work, then you can incorporate it into your dissertation. And so I spent a lot of time putting proposals together, and I submitted grant applications to focus on studying the status of that endangered crocodile species in Sumatra in Indonesia. And one of those applications was through National Geographic for something called the Young Explorer Grant. I was 24, 25 years old at the time. And sure enough, I got that grant. And it was one of the initial grants that funded that project out of the gate. It took a lot of effort and it took a lot of initiative to try and push that forward. But that has now translated into an ongoing project over 10 years later. I'm still working on those Sunda Gharials, building that team of people, and we're asking all kinds of questions about the species and trying to provide data that can help conserve the species because they are endangered. But yeah, it started with that Nat Geo grant and a couple of other grants through the IUCN at the time, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and the Crocodile Specialist Group that's associated with them. So they have specialist groups for a whole range of different species. But it was very important.
So your title through this grant is now that you are a National Geographic Explorer. And that's a title for life. No one can take that away from you, correct?
Yeah, it's great. So it also gave me that affiliation with Nat Geo that I'll carry for life. And hopefully I'll be able to work with them as much as possible. And there's a whole group of explorers throughout the world. And sometimes they have networking events. We went to one in Washington, D.C. last year. And you get to meet all these interesting researchers from throughout the world that are tackling all kinds of interesting science questions. And they also have storytellers and educators associated with that Explorer program. And it's a great opportunity to continue to network and interact with folks from throughout the world.
So you get this grant, you're 25 years old, you leave the country for the first time, you go to the swamps of Indonesia. What was your first welcome to the jungle moment?
Oh, man. Yeah. I was totally overwhelmed with just like all the new things that were happening, the new languages that were being spoken. Like you said, I had never even been to Mexico or Canada at that point. So Indonesia was my first introduction. When we got into the jungle for the first time, into one of the more remote places, we found Sumatran tiger tracks in some of the areas that we were camping. And, the mountain lions that we study, they're serious predators. They can kill 700-pound elk. I've seen the dead elk, but that's just 100 or 150-pound mountain lion. And so when you're looking at the tracks of a Sumatran tiger that's probably 300, 350 pounds, you really start to think about what are these wild creatures doing out here? What are some of the interesting things that you would never see growing up in North America, right? Like in some of these different places. So yeah, it was kind of a shock to see stuff like that. And then we also got to see crocodiles. We got to see hornbills. We got to see a whole range of other wild creatures. They have reticulated pythons that live out there. They have king cobras. We didn't see every single one of those things, but you start to learn about what's living in those jungles, and it's very different than what we have here.
The football instincts kicked in, head on a swivel.
Yes, absolutely. Head on a swivel. Yeah.
Well, the crocodiles must have been very fascinating. And looking at your website, there's also pictures of you interacting with the native people of Indonesia.
Yes.
People who probably have never left their communities before. What was that like, just being able to develop relationships with people that you cannot communicate with in your native language and having to rely on them to help you find what you need in these research efforts?
Yeah, that was amazing. Also, one of the most eye-opening parts of all of this work, working internationally. So I've been amazed with the people that I've had an opportunity to work with, just amazing in every single way. But trying to learn how to communicate with them was one of the hardest parts. So I hired a translator. The translator spoke broken English. And so it just trying to have conversations and trying to solve problems took a lot of sitting down, and it took patience on both sides, right? And then you start to learn about the lives that these people are living in some of these remote jungle areas, and just the things that they know, the traditional ecological knowledge that they have is incredible. And I can think of one kind of amazing example. There's many people that I've worked with that were amazing, but this guy named Cosno, and he grew up working in the forests. He worked all over Indonesia, and he was a fisherman, and he lived right on the side of the river. And he was one of the initial people that guided us into the forest. I would consider him to be one of the world's leading experts on that species that we were studying. He was one of the few people that interacted with them on a regular basis. And, you know, we talk about the scientists that are coming in to study these things as the experts, when in reality, many of them have very little observational experience with these animals, right? Like, they know how to run some of the numbers and they know how to design the experiments, but a lot of these local folks are the ones that have seen these animals in the wild. And I learned more from Cosno than I ever did from any of the scientific papers, right? Which there weren't very many on that species. But yeah, the local people, they're everything to these projects.
Was there a piece of gear or anything that you brought on this trip that you were thankful that you had?
So I would say one big thing was having a hammock, and that was to get off of the ground. So in a lot of these places, we would be lucky enough, there would be like an old fishing hut or something, and we could get up there on a platform and be off the ground. But in some areas, we didn't have that. And there's all kinds of different biting insects and little creatures that can cause a lot of damage. And if you're on the ground, you're kind of now a food item for all those little things, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about the big creatures, the crocodiles, the tigers, all of those things, but it's the little things that actually a lot of times are more likely to get you. And it could be something as simple as ants, and maybe it's just going to be really uncomfortable because you get some bites, or you could pick up some kind of infectious disease, right? And then you're thinking about all the microorganisms at that point, the really little creatures. And that's not necessarily associated with just sleeping on the ground, but just kind of in general, those are something that I thought about more. But the hammock at least helped with getting us off the ground and getting us away from some of those things.
It's funny that you don't think of something as simple as a hammock being a useful tool, but it probably comes in the clutch in those kind of situations. Since we're talking about wildlife survival, I did want to bring up something that we have talked about previously. You were left in Alaska looking for wood buffalo, and you were there for 8 days straight alone.
Yes.
I can't imagine being anywhere alone for 8 days. What did you learn about yourself, and what did you learn in general that is useful for survival tactics?
Yeah, so that was an incredible experience. I was working with a guy named Tom Seaton, and he's the chief wood bison biologist for Alaska Fish and Game. He's been helping with that project for a long time. He's been running it. And I had the opportunity to go out with him, and he dropped me off to collect GPS collars that had fallen off of bison. So they were also doing a tracking project. And I had a 17-foot aluminum boat, and basically set me up with 3 barrels of fuel and a shotgun for bears, and said, I'll be back in 8 days. And he took off. He flew away. And that was about a 4-hour flight southwest of Fairbanks. And so Fairbanks is already kind of the last stop. And everything underneath that 4-hour flight was roadless wilderness, right? So there's nothing in all directions. You might run into a small community, 100 miles in one direction or 75 miles in the other direction. But other than that, there's nothing out there. There's no roads. And so I was able to go out and start navigating all these rivers, trying to collect these collars. And I would say the most dangerous thing, and the thing that I started to familiarize myself with on that trip, was the actual river itself. There are grizzly bears out there and there are wolves. The wolves are really not a high concern. They don't hardly ever attack people. The grizzlies are a small concern. That it doesn't happen often, but it can be a serious problem. And black bears, the same thing. I had a gun for that, which gave me some comfort. But the river itself, it could turn dangerous really fast. And if the weather shifted, if the wind was coming hard from one direction, some of the currents on those big rivers got dangerous quick. And if a person were to flip a boat in the middle of a big river like that, it would be very hard for them to get out because it was so cold and because the rapids were pretty rough, and it would have been a long swim if you're in the middle of that river to try and get to the side. And I covered about 300 miles of river over the course of that 8 days.
Were you in the water the entire time, or were you able to find shore and rest there?
Yeah.
Because I can imagine that would probably add a layer of difficulty if you had to sleep in the boat.
I did have the opportunity to pull into shore. The way it would work is because there's no roads there, basically the rivers are your road. And that's how I would move from location to location. And then I would set up camp wherever I stopped at the end of the day on the shoreline. And I would also navigate inland and try and hike in and find those collars. It was a labyrinth of sloughs and small tributaries and large tributaries. And then there were swamplands and forests. I mean, it was a very complex and interesting ecosystem, and not a sign of human inhabitants anywhere. It was amazing.
And unlike Indonesia, you didn't have a guide this time. So you were going into this blind, right?
Yes. Yeah. So I asked a lot of questions before I got out there and ran a lot of things by Tom, because he would be the local expert in that context. But once you're out there, that's it. Right. And there's not a lot of help other than trying to figure things out on your own. So yeah, it was amazing. It was one of my favorite experiences because it's one of the wildest places left on the planet. And just to spend time in a place like that is really amazing. We went back there in the wintertime. So that was a summer trip. And in the winter on our flight out, we had to wear a full warm suit and something called bunny boots, which are these very insulated boots. And in the cockpit of the plane during that 4-hour flight, you're scrunched in there. It's a 2-seater. The temperature inside was 5 degrees for 4 hours. And then by the time you're on the ground, it's negative. So it was probably 10 below zero for much of the trip. It would drop down to -20 or -30 on some occasions. And we were staying in a small cabin on a frozen lake. And you would see the northern lights during the nighttime and just these bright green ripples of color whipping across the sky. And it's kind of hypnotizing. It's something that you could never imagine, and you can't really appreciate it from just pictures. Just to be able to stand out there and see those phenomenon happening, it was incredible.
That does sound incredible. Well, we talked about mountain lions. We talked about crocodiles. Any other research that you're currently working on or things that you're hoping to pursue in the near future?
Yeah, so we're actively expanding the cougar project in New Mexico. So we'll be doing a lot of that work. We are actively expanding the Sunda Gharial work in Indonesia. And we're going to move into Borneo for the next phase of that project. That was funded by a group called CrocFest. And I'm starting a Pan-American bird migration project. And so in North America, there's over 900 species of birds out in the wild, and over 300 of those are considered neotropical migrating species, which means that they go from places in the United States and Canada to somewhere in Latin America every single year for their annual migration, and then they return. And so we're talking about thousands of miles that these birds travel for these migrations. And they can inhabit ecosystems from the Arctic to the Texas Hill Country, to the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, all the way down to the Amazon basin in a single year, right? And so it's really amazing what these birds can do. Some of them are bigger, and you'll have large raptors, different hawk species that make these migrations, but some of them are very small. They would weigh the same as roughly 2 or 3 quarters in the palm of your hand, and they can make these round trip journeys that are thousands of miles. The thing is there's a lot that we still don't know about those migratory routes and where those birds are stopping, and also how geographically places are linked together in their summer breeding and winter non-breeding areas, right? So there could be birds that we have in Texas, and we don't know if they end up in Mexico or if they end up in the Amazon rainforest in South America. But it would be really important for us to know what those linkages are, because if some of those birds leave here during their migration and they arrive in a place in South America that has been altered, the landscape has been converted into agriculture or turned into housing developments or burned in a fire, there's a high likelihood that those birds will not return here. And so it's really important for us to understand what's going on, where they're moving. So we're going to track those birds and then also map out what are the threats on the ground in all the places they stop and spend their winter, at least the species that we know less about as a scientific community. That'll be our main focus. And then aside from that project, I'm always actively looking for other projects and recruiting students and looking for ways to expand the lab. Things are really just getting started, and I would envision projects could be on a whole range of different wildlife and biodiversity and conservation challenges in the future.
Well, before I let you go, I want to make sure we give you a shout out to your YouTube channel. I was doing some research on you and I found this channel, Wildlife and Wilderness Science with Dr. Kyle Shaney. Are you trying to become the next Steve Irwin?
I wouldn't say that I'm trying to be Steve Irwin by any means. I'll never be able to reach that level of awesomeness, but he did inspire me in many ways when I was a kid. I doubt I would study crocodiles now if it wasn't for him. He was one of my favorite people and one of my heroes. But what I do want to do is at least get some educational information out there as much as possible for the general public. And so that's the reason for trying to put up a few things here and there and share some of these things. I want folks to be excited and hopefully see how incredible the natural world is, and hopefully find some kind of inspiration and awe for all of these wild things. So I'm going to continue to try and improve and add material to that as time goes on.
Well, I want to sell this channel a little bit more so you can get some subscribers, because I see there's videos of scorpions, walking sticks, vipers. Well, there's one video with a rattlesnake that's kind of just staring at you while it's shaking its rattle. Incredible channel. You got to go check it out yourself. I'm glad that you were able to join us today. This has been fantastic. I hope we can talk to you again soon, learn a little bit more about the things that you're working on, get an update on some of those upcoming adventures and other research opportunities. But Dr. Shaney, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
This episode of Launchpad is brought to you by the Office of University Strategic Communications at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Make sure you subscribe to our channel right now, and for more great content, click right here.